Imagine living in a world where no one knows what bacteria or viruses are, where diseases were seen as divine punishments or the result of astrological influences. With no vaccines, no antibiotics, how did medieval people manage to survive? The truth is that, despite their limited knowledge, they developed surprising methods to prevent diseases, some of which still make sense today. In this video, we'll explore how medieval medicine worked, the secrets of hygiene, the use of medicinal herbs, and even the strangest beliefs that helped protect people from deadly epidemics. 1. The medieval mindset on diseases. In the Middle Ages, medical science was still in its infancy, and most people had no idea that microorganisms caused diseases. Without microscopes or knowledge of bacteria and viruses, explanations for illnesses were based on philosophical, religious, and even astrological beliefs. One of the most widely accepted medical theories of the time was the theory of humors, inherited from the ancient Greeks, particularly Hippocrates and Galen. This theory stated that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health depended on the perfect balance of these humors, and any disease was seen as a sign that one of these elements was either excessive or deficient. Because of this belief, medieval doctors often recommended bloodletting, specific diets, and even the use of leeches to restore the body's balance. Religion also played a massive role. Most people believed that diseases were divine punishments for sins, whether personal or communal. When a plague struck a city, many saw it as God's wrath and sought atonement through fasting, self-flagellation, and pilgrimages to holy sites. Relics of saints were also considered powerful sources of healing, and churches often displayed bones or garments of religious figures believed to protect the faithful from illness. Another curious aspect was the role of astrology in medieval medicine. Doctors frequently consulted astrological charts to diagnose patients and determine the best days for treatments. It was believed that each organ in the body was associated with a zodiac sign and that celestial bodies influenced health. A medieval physician might refuse to perform surgery if the stars were not aligned favorably. Although these practices may seem superstitious today, some were surprisingly close to reality. Even though medieval doctors were unaware of germs, they had already observed that certain environmental conditions affected health. For instance, overcrowded and filthy cities were linked to disease outbreaks, leading to early efforts in hygiene to mitigate the spread of illness. But how did these beliefs influence disease prevention methods? What steps did people take to avoid getting sick? The answers lie in the fascinating practices we will explore next. 2. Hygiene in baths, myth or truth? There is a popular myth that medieval people were completely filthy, covered in dirt, and never bathed. But is that really true? The answer is more complicated than it seems. In reality, hygiene in the Middle Ages was quite different from today's standards. But that doesn't mean people didn't care about cleanliness. Bathing was common, especially among the upper classes. Many medieval towns had public bathhouses where people could relax in large communal tubs. Some of these were heated and operated similarly to ancient Roman baths. Additionally, nobles and royalty often had their own bathtubs inside castles. They used aromatic herbs like lavender and rosemary to scent the water and believed these herbs could purify the body from diseases. Medieval doctors actually recommended bathing regularly, as they thought the skin needed to release bad humors that could cause illness. However, over time, attitudes toward bathing began to change, especially during major epidemics like the Black Death. Many started to believe that hot water opened the pores, making the body more vulnerable to disease. As a result, instead of bathing frequently, some people opted to simply change their clothes regularly, believing this was enough to stay clean. Peasants who lacked access to luxurious bathhouses washed in rivers, streams, or even small wooden barrels filled with water. Personal hygiene varied greatly depending on the region and economic status. While some communities maintained relatively good cleanliness habits, others lived in conditions where sanitation was non-existent, allowing diseases to spread more easily. Another crucial aspect of medieval hygiene was oral and hand care. Though toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist, people used linen cloths, powdered charcoal, or crushed nutshells to clean their teeth. Washing hands before meals was also a common practice among the educated, especially among noble families and merchants. Despite some basic hygiene practices, poor sanitation in medieval cities remained a serious issue. Narrow streets, open sewers, and piles of garbage created the perfect environment for disease outbreaks. Many doctors recommended using perfumes and aromatic herbs to purify the air, an ineffective but well-intended attempt at preventing infections. So, were medieval people truly filthy? Not exactly. Hygiene varied based on social class and contemporary beliefs, but the idea that no one bathed is a huge exaggeration. Still, their limited understanding of germs meant that many of their efforts were ineffective in preventing disease. 3. Diet and medicinal herbs, the first line of defense. During medieval times, food was not just a necessity, it was also considered a way to prevent diseases. Since doctors believed that health depended on balancing the body's humors, diet was seen as an essential tool to maintain that balance and avoid illness. Foods were classified according to their hot, cold, moist, or dry properties, based on the logic of the theory of humors. For instance, red meat and red wine were considered hot and stimulating, while fish and vegetables were seen as cooling and balancing. A medieval doctor might prescribe a diet depending on a patient's condition. If someone was cold and melancholic, they should eat fatty meats and drink warm beverages to restore balance. For peasants, the staple diet consisted of bread, vegetables, oat porridge, and small amounts of meat or fish when available. Nobles, on the other hand, had access to a richer diet, including roasted meats, imported spices, and a variety of fruits and cheeses. However, this luxury wasn't always beneficial. Many nobles suffered from gout and digestive problems due to excessive meat and wine consumption. Beyond diet, medicinal herbs played a crucial role in disease prevention. Monks, healers, and physicians used plants to treat and prevent illnesses, relying on knowledge passed down from the Greeks and Romans. Some of the most commonly used herbs included garlic, known for its antibacterial properties and used to strengthen the body against infections. Mint, used for digestive issues and headaches. Sage, considered an herb that brought life and improved memory. Chamomile, prescribed to calm the body and aid in fever recovery. Rosemary, used to purify the air and protect against contagious diseases. Many of these natural remedies actually had real benefits, even though medieval people didn't fully understand how they worked. Today, we know that garlic, for example, contains compounds with antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. Interestingly, some medieval dietary practices align with modern recommendations. The consumption of hot broths and soups during illness, for example, was a common tradition, as it was believed to restore the body's energy. And in fact, drinking warm fluids during colds can help relieve symptoms and provide essential nutrients. However, as with most medieval medicine, some beliefs were completely misguided. The idea that consuming liquid gold or crushed gemstones could strengthen the body was popular among the nobility, despite having no real health benefits. In the end, medieval nutrition was a mix of tradition, superstition, and discoveries that, in many cases, had a scientific basis. While far from perfect, it helped people naturally strengthen their defenses against diseases. 4. Quarantine and isolation, the medieval method we still use today. When we think of quarantines and isolation, we often associate them with modern disease control methods. However, the idea of separating the sick to prevent the spread of epidemics was already practiced in the Middle Ages, and surprisingly, with some effectiveness. The need for isolation became evident due to the frequent waves of bubonic plague that ravaged Europe. Without knowing that the disease was caused by a bacterium transmitted by fleas on infected rats, medieval authorities noticed that it spread quickly among people who had contact with one another. This realization led to the adoption of one of the most effective strategies of the time: quarantine. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. This period was first established in the city of Venice, one of the main ports of medieval Europe. To prevent ships from bringing diseases, authorities required that any suspicious vessel remain isolated for 40 days before its passengers and goods were allowed to enter the city. This practice helped reduce the spread of infections and was later adopted by other cities. Beyond maritime quarantines, some communities enforced sanitary cordons, sealing off entire villages and neighborhoods to prevent infected individuals from escaping and spreading disease elsewhere. One of the most remarkable cases occurred in the village of Eyam, England, in 1665, during a plague outbreak. The residents, knowing they were infected, decided to self-isolate, preventing the disease from spreading to nearby towns. Although many of them perished, their decision saved thousands of lives. Another medieval disease control method was the use of isolation houses, where sick individuals were taken to be kept away from the rest of the population. Some of these facilities were poorly maintained and acted more like death houses, offering little to no treatment. However, in certain parts of Italy, organized hospitals existed, attempting to provide at least some form of care. It is fascinating to note that some of these strategies are still in use today. During outbreaks of contagious diseases, such as COVID-19, Isolating the sick and quarantining travelers were crucial measures to contain the spread of the virus, just as the Venetians did centuries ago. Medieval medicine was filled with misconceptions, but when it came to preventing the spread of diseases, the methods of quarantine and isolation proved to be surprisingly effective and remain relevant even today. 5. Amulets and superstitions. Mystical protection against disease. Before the advancement of medical science, many people believed that diseases had supernatural origins. Evil spirits, demons, or even astrological forces were thought to be responsible for mysterious illnesses and plagues. As a result, protection against these threats didn't come only from remedies and diets, but also from amulets, talismans, and magical rituals. One of the most popular protective objects of the time was the toadstone, a gem supposedly found inside the heads of old toads. It was believed to protect against poisons and diseases, and many people wore rings or necklaces with toadstones to ward off infections. Another common belief was that certain crystals and precious stones, such as amber and sapphire, had the power to purify the body and keep diseases away. In addition to stones, religious medallions were widely used. Many people believed that carrying a cross, a reliquary containing fragments of saints' bones, or even pieces of sacred garments could offer protection against plagues. The Catholic Church encouraged this practice, and some relics became incredibly valuable, attracting pilgrims who hoped to be cured or shielded by their presence. Another curious method of protection was the use of herbal sachets and aromatic pouches, which people carried around their necks or hung in their homes. Some of the most popular combinations included lavender and rosemary, to purify the air and ward off disease; rue and garlic, to repel evil spirits and protect against infections; cloves and cinnamon, considered natural antiseptics that helped keep the environment clean. During the Black Death, plague doctors wore long-beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs. They believed that disease was transmitted through bad air, miasma, and that these scents could filter the air and prevent infection. While this belief was incorrect, interestingly, some of these substances did have antimicrobial properties that might have offered slight protection against bacteria and viruses in the environment. Beyond objects and herbs, rituals and magical gestures were common. Some people drew protective symbols on doors and windows to prevent evil spirits from entering their homes. Others believed that chanting certain words or prayers aloud could drive illnesses away. Of course, today we know that these methods had no real effect against infections. However, the use of amulets and superstitions provided psychological comfort to people, giving them a sense of control in a world where medical knowledge was still very limited. 6. Doctors and healers, who treated diseases. Before the discovery of germs, falling ill was a major problem, not only because diseases were poorly understood, but also because not everyone had access to trained doctors. Medieval medicine was divided among academic physicians, barber surgeons, and folk healers, each with their own methods and limitations. Academic physicians were those who studied at universities, typically influenced by ancient Greek and Roman texts, such as those of Hippocrates and Galen. They worked primarily for the nobility and the church, offering treatments based on the theory of humors. Their therapies included bloodletting, special diets, and purging to rebalance the body. However, these doctors were expensive and inaccessible to most of the population. Meanwhile, barber surgeons played a more practical role, performing procedures such as tooth extractions, abscess drainage, amputations, and even minor surgeries. The name comes from the fact that many barbers also worked as surgeons, as they were skilled with sharp blades. Since anesthesia did not exist, these procedures were extremely painful and risky, but often the only option available. Most of the population relied on folk healers, who were often women. They used medicinal herbs, poultices, and infusions to treat wounds and common illnesses. These treatments were sometimes effective, as these healers had deep knowledge of plants and their applications. However, the church and academic physicians frequently distrusted them, and some were even accused of witchcraft. Monks and nuns also played an essential role in medieval medicine. Many monasteries maintained rudimentary hospitals, where they cared for the sick and injured, providing rest, food, and herbal treatments. Their approach was more charitable and spiritual, believing that faith aided in recovery. However, some treatments were completely ineffective and even dangerous. Certain medical practices included the use of mercury and arsenic, which are highly toxic, as well as excessive bloodletting, which further weakened the patient. Additionally, medieval doctors had no knowledge of sterilization and hygiene, making any surgery a serious risk for infection. Despite many misconceptions, some practices developed during the Middle Ages laid the groundwork for modern medicine. Even without understanding germs and bacteria, medieval healers and doctors observed patterns and developed rudimentary methods that, in some cases, actually worked. 7. The role of religion and prayer in disease prevention. In medieval society, religion was one of the pillars of society and influenced nearly every aspect of life, including health. Since people didn't understand the true causes of disease, many believed that illnesses were divine punishments for humanity's sins. As a result, one of the most common ways to try to avoid sickness was through prayers, penance, and seeking spiritual protection. The Catholic Church played a central role in shaping how health was perceived. When an epidemic struck, religious leaders encouraged people to participate in processions, fasting, and special masses to ask for God's forgiveness and drive the disease away. Some communities believed that self-flagellation, causing harm to one's own body, could demonstrate repentance and thus protect them from the plague. This movement, known as flagellantism, became especially popular during the Black Death. In addition to collective prayers, many turned to holy relics and protective saints to ward off illness. Some of the most popular saints included Saint Roch, considered the patron saint against plagues and epidemics. Saint Sebastian, believed to protect against contagious diseases. Saint Apollonia, invoked for relief from toothaches and dental problems. Churches and monasteries also distributed religious amulets and medallions, which many people wore as a form of divine protection against diseases. For many, carrying a piece of cloth that had touched a holy relic was considered just as effective as any medicine. Another interesting custom was the use of medicinal holy water, which was believed to have healing powers. Some churches distributed this water for people to drink or rub on their bodies in times of illness. However, religion's influence on medieval health was not entirely based on superstition. Monasteries played a crucial role in preserving and copying ancient medical texts, helping to maintain classical medical knowledge. Additionally, many monks studied medicinal herbs and provided basic treatments to the sick in monastic hospitals. While faith was an important part of medieval life, many of these practices did not actually protect against disease, and in some cases, they even made things worse. Large processions, for example, brought crowds together in tight spaces, making it easier for plagues and epidemics to spread. Today, we know that faith can have a positive effect on emotional and mental health, helping people cope with stress and fear. However, medieval religious practices alone were not effective in preventing disease. 8. Cities versus villages. Who was healthier? If you lived in the Middle Ages, where would you have a better chance of avoiding disease? In a bustling city or an isolated rural village? The answer might seem obvious, but the reality was more complicated. Both urban centers and rural areas had their own health challenges, and life in each place directly influenced life expectancy and the risk of infections. Medieval cities were commercial, political, and cultural hubs, but they were also a sanitary nightmare. Streets were narrow, buildings were overcrowded, and sewage was often dumped directly into alleys. Indoor toilets were rare, and many homes shared open pits for waste disposal. Since there was no efficient garbage collection, food scraps, human waste, and dead animals piled up, creating the perfect environment for rats, insects, and disease. Additionally, frequent human contact made cities especially vulnerable to epidemics. When the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, urban centers suffered enormous population losses, as the close proximity between people allowed the disease to spread rapidly. In some cities, such as Florence and London, up to half the population died within months. However, living in a city also had advantages. There was better access to doctors and healers, as well as monasteries that provided basic care for the sick. Urban markets offered a more varied diet, with availability of meat, grains, and medicinal herbs that were not always accessible in the countryside. Additionally, some cities started implementing rudimentary hygiene measures, such as laws banning sewage dumping in certain areas and mandatory quarantines for travelers suspected of carrying diseases. In rural villages, the risk of epidemics was lower because there was less human contact and greater access to fresh air and clean water. Most peasants lived far from large population centers, which helped prevent outbreaks of contagious diseases. Additionally, their diet was more natural and less processed, consisting of fresh vegetables and meat from hunting or small livestock. However, country life also had serious health challenges. Medical care was almost non-existent, and many simple illnesses could become fatal due to a lack of treatment. Wound infections, childbirth complications, and nutritional deficiencies were common problems. Additionally, crop failures and harsh winters could lead to famine, weakening the body and making peasants more vulnerable to disease. Another important factor was access to clean drinking water. While city rivers and wells were often contaminated with sewage, village water sources were generally cleaner. However, without knowledge of microorganisms, many rural communities still drank from questionable sources, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and other intestinal diseases. In the end, neither place was completely safe. While cities struggled with contagious diseases, rural villages faced challenges, such as lack of medical care and vulnerability to hunger and infections. Life expectancy was low in both environments. But interestingly, some of the oldest people of the time were peasants who lived a simpler life, far from the dangers of urban overcrowding. 9. Did medieval medicine actually work? Medieval medicine was a mix of inherited knowledge, empirical observations, and superstitious beliefs. Some practices actually helped prevent and treat diseases, while others were completely ineffective or even dangerous. But in the end, which medieval methods actually worked, and which ones put people's lives at risk? Even though medieval doctors didn't understand germs and bacteria, some practices had logical and even scientific foundations. Use of medicinal herbs. Some herbs used in the Middle Ages genuinely had therapeutic properties. Garlic, for example, was used to strengthen the body against infections, and today we know it has antibacterial properties. Willow bark, used to relieve pain, contains a compound similar to aspirin. Quarantine and isolation. As we saw earlier, separating the sick was one of the most effective strategies to prevent the spread of epidemics, making it one of the few medieval medical practices still widely used today. Diet and nutrition. The belief that certain foods helped maintain strength was partially correct. Some medieval diets were naturally rich in vegetables, fiber, and proteins, providing basic nutrition that helped the body fight diseases. Personal hygiene. Though practices varied over the centuries, washing hands before meals and occasionally bathing helped reduce the spread of some illnesses. On the other hand, many medieval medical practices not only failed to cure diseases, but also made conditions worse. Excessive bloodletting. Based on the theory of humors, bloodletting was a common practice to purify the body. Doctors would cut veins or use leeches to remove blood from the patient. In many cases, this only weakened the person further, accelerating death. Toxic remedies. Mercury, arsenic, and lead were used in treatments, especially for venereal diseases. Today, we know these metals are highly toxic and can cause severe damage to the body. Exorcisms and magical healers. Mental illnesses or unknown conditions were often treated with exorcisms or religious rituals. Instead of receiving proper treatment, many patients suffering from conditions like epilepsy or neurological disorders were left to die. Talismans and superstitions. While they may have had a psychological effect, carrying magical stones or religious medallions offered no real protection against disease. Despite its flaws, medieval medicine was an important step in the evolution of medical science. Some practices helped build the knowledge that eventually led to modern medicine, while others proved to be dangerous and were abandoned over time. 10. What can we learn from medieval medicine? After exploring medieval methods of disease prevention, one big question remains: do any of these practices still make sense today? While modern medicine has advanced tremendously, some medieval strategies are still in use, with improvements, of course, while others have been completely discarded. One of the biggest legacies of medieval medicine is the concept of quarantine and isolation. The Venetians realized that keeping potentially sick individuals separated for a period of time helped slow the spread of epidemics. This tactic continues to be applied today, especially in times of global health crises. Another relevant point is the use of medicinal herbs. While medieval doctors didn't know exactly how these plants worked, many of them had real antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. Garlic, chamomile, and willow bark are just a few examples of natural ingredients that are still part of modern pharmacology. The idea that diet influences health also remains true. Even though the theory of humors has been abandoned, we now understand that a balanced diet strengthens the immune system and reduces the risk of disease. Interestingly, some medieval dietary practices, such as consuming nutritious broths to combat illness, are still recommended today. On the other hand, the lack of knowledge about hygiene and contamination cost many lives. Medieval doctors did not understand the importance of sterilization and proper sanitation, making any surgery extremely dangerous. Today we know that strict cleanliness and disinfection are essential for preventing infections. Superstitious beliefs, such as the use of amulets and exorcisms to ward off disease, proved to be completely ineffective. However, these rituals provided psychological comfort, something that is still considered important for patient recovery in difficult situations. In the end, the Middle Ages teach us that even without fully understanding the mechanisms of disease, humans have always sought ways to protect themselves and survive. Some of these strategies worked and were improved, while others were left behind as part of history. The most fascinating realization is that even centuries later, we still use and refine many of these medieval medical lessons. And had you heard of these methods before? Which of these medieval practices do you think could still be useful today?